When people think about NASCAR's first race in 1949, there are a few things that usually come to mind. The track, the winner, and the beginning of what would become one of the biggest motorsports in the world. But there's one detail that often gets overlooked. That same day, a woman lined up on the grid competing against some of the sport's earliest pioneers. Her name was Sarah Christian, and she became the first woman to start a race in what is now NASCAR's top series. And in that moment, women in NASCAR weren't a future possibility, but rather, they were already part of the sport.
Start with Fonty Flock and 14 in the lead as they go barreling into the first turn.
The presence of women in racing isn't something new. In fact, it dates all the way back to NASCAR's very first season. In 1949 alone, 3 women competed at the highest level of the sport. Sarah Christian didn't just participate, she finished 5th, a result that still stands today as the best finish by a woman in the NASCAR Cup Series. Then there was Ethel Flock, who raced against her own brothers and managed to beat 2 of them in competition. And Louise Smith, who originally showed up as a spectator, entered a race on a whim, crashed during the event, and still went on to build a long racing career. These weren't isolated moments, they were early signs that women had a place in NASCAR from the very beginning.
There were no women in the sport at the time, and so that made her different, and it made a lot of people ask, what does she think she's doing? Who does she think she is?
But the progress in motorsports doesn't always happen all at once. After that early wave in 1949, it would take decades before another woman broke through at NASCAR's highest level. That breakthrough came in the 1970s with Janet Guthrie, an aerospace engineer who made the leap into professional racing. Guthrie didn't just compete, she made history. She became the first woman to race in the Daytona 500, the first to lead laps in a NASCAR Cup Series event, and one of the first to consistently run inside the top 10. In 1977, she added to that legacy by competing in both the Daytona 500 and the Indianapolis 500 in the same year, something that was almost unheard of at the time. More than anything, Janet Guthrie proved that women weren't just capable of racing at the highest level, they could be competitive.
But I think the biggest surprise of all is the car that's sitting on the pole. This could be the only other driver in NASCAR racing with a ponytail and an earring just like me.
By the time the 80s rolled around, more female drivers entered NASCAR on a full-time basis and somehow set more records. Patty Moyes became a regular in what is today the NASCAR O'Reilly Auto Parts Series throughout the 80s and 90s, and at some points was an owner-driver on the track. Robin Dallenbach, Wally Dallenbach's wife, became the youngest female to qualify for a NASCAR Cup Series event at the young age of 18 in 1982 with Jim Stacy Racing. And a driver by the name of Shauna Robinson was competing in NASCAR's Dash Series and scoring victories, becoming the first woman to ever do so in any NASCAR sanctioned event. By the time the 2000s rolled around, the thought of women coming into motorsports no longer became an experiment, but rather a movement that needed to be accepted, as it felt like it wouldn't be long before one of NASCAR's top 3 divisions was going to see a female in victory lane. But it was at the turn of the millennium where things started to shift in a different direction.
31st quickest in practice earlier, but what a year she's already had in those 5 ARCA races. 3 top 5 finishes, 4 top 10s, and 2 poles.
In the mid-2000s, big names were starting to appear on the radar for future rides in NASCAR's Premier Series. This included the likes of Aaron Crocker, a driver who won the 2004 Knoxville National Rookie of the Year award, and Deborah Renshaw, an up-and-coming racer. Both received future full-time rides in the then Busch Series to compete against top talent in the sport in hopes that the gap could finally close. However, it would be controversy instead that caught up to these drivers before they ever had a shot to show their talent. For Aaron Crocker, her controversy rose when it was discovered that she was having a private relationship with her then car owner, Ray Eberham. a story that shattered the racing world when it was discovered in 2006. It unfortunately killed Crocker's racing career, as no one looked at her as a future racing prospect, but rather Ray Abraham's new girlfriend. An unfortunate setback, to say the least. Deborah Renshaw's situation was far more tragic, as during a practice session in the ARCA series at Charlotte, a minor accident would turn deadly as Eric Martin spun out at the exit of turn 4 on the track, where the car remained motionless for an extended period of time. Almost 15 seconds later, Renshaw would come barreling in and slam the stalled race car, killing the driver in the stalled car.
Now, like the others, Renshaw clearly had no idea the car was there.
That impact occurred more than 8 seconds after Martin's car had come to a complete stop. Martin's car was destroyed as the impact tore away the engine and left a part of the wheel assembly lying on the racetrack.
The incident was caused by spotters not being up in the stands while cars were out on the track. However, some put the blame on Renshaw herself, causing even more negativity on the progression in the sport. It was at this point that the sport needed someone big to come in and keep the progression alive. By the mid-2000s, NASCAR was still waiting for the next major breakthrough when it came to women in the sport. And then, almost out of nowhere, that breakthrough seemed to arrive.
Move over! The lady is coming through! Danica Patrick wins at Twin Ring Motegi! She'll never be called the Anna Kournikova of open wheel racing.
Danica Patrick, welcome to IndyCar Victory Lane.
Danica Patrick had already made a name for herself in open wheel racing, but in 2005, she burst into the national spotlight at the Indianapolis 500. As a rookie, she didn't just compete, she nearly won the race, ultimately finishing 4th, the best finish ever by a woman in the event at the time. That moment alone would have been enough to put her on the map, but just a few years later, she took it even further. In 2008, Patrick won the Indy Japan 300, becoming the first woman in history to win a major open wheel race. At that point, she wasn't just a rising driver anymore. She was one of the biggest names in all of motorsports. Sponsors lined up to work with her, she appeared in national commercials, and she brought a level of attention to racing that very few drivers ever had. Naturally, the next question became impossible to ignore. What would happen if Danica Patrick came to NASCAR?
Danica Patrick is expected to announce that she will drive NASCAR, making her debut next year.
When Danica Patrick made the move to NASCAR, the expectations were massive. At the time, NASCAR was still the most popular form of motorsports in the United States, and the idea of a driver with her level of recognition entering the sport created a huge amount of attention. From the start, she was one of the most talked about drivers in the field, and early on, there were signs that the hype might actually turn into results. In 2013, Patrick made history by winning the pole for the Daytona 500, becoming the first woman to ever do so. She led laps in the race and ultimately finished 8th, the best finish by a woman in Daytona 500 history. For a moment, it felt like the breakthrough was right around the corner. But as the seasons went on, the results never quite matched the expectations. She showed flashes of competitiveness, but consistent top finishes were very difficult to come by. And over time, the conversation around her began to shift drastically.
What are you doing? Danica, seriously! You did the same thing in practice. You did the same thing.
I did not.
You get on my left rear and it spins me out.
Across 7 full seasons in the NASCAR Cup Series, Patrick recorded 7 top 10 finishes, 1 pole position, which was that Daytona 500, and a career best points finish of 24th. On paper, those results placed her among many mid-pack drivers that NASCAR has seen over the years. But Danica Patrick was never treated like just another driver. She had been positioned as the next superstar, and when the wins never came, the criticism became louder. Some fans still saw her as the trailblazer who had opened doors for women in racing, but others began to view her as a driver who didn't live up to the hype. And that shift in perception didn't just affect her career, it started to influence how people viewed women competing in NASCAR as a whole.
So this will be my last season as a full-time driver.
After Danica Patrick stepped away from NASCAR following the 2008 Daytona 500, many believed it was only a matter of time before the next female driver rose through the ranks. After all, the visibility she brought to the sport had been massive. More attention, more opportunities, more young drivers entering the pipeline. So there had to be another driver ready to fill that spot soon, right? After Danica Patrick stepped away from NASCAR in 2018, the expectation was pretty straightforward. Another driver would follow. At that point, women had already been part of NASCAR for decades, and with the level of attention Danica brought to the sport, it felt like the next breakthrough wasn't far away. And for a moment, it looked like that might actually happen. A new group of drivers began to emerge, each bringing their own level of success and attention. Hailie Deegan quickly became one of the most talked about young drivers in the sport after winning races in the K&N Pro West Series, now known as the ARCA West Series today. Her aggressive driving style and strong personality made her a perfect fit for the NASCAR spotlight. At the same time, you also had Natalie Decker, who entered the National Series with strong sponsorship backing and a growing presence in both the ARCA and Truck Series. And then there was Toni Breidinger, who came into stock car racing as the winningest female driver in USAC history, one of the most accomplished resumes of any driver entering the pipeline. On paper, everything was there. You had talent, funding, and of course, opportunity.
Great battle up front. There's battles all over the racetrack on this side. Hailie Deegan gets a shove.
But the question remained, were the results going to come together? As each driver moved up the ladder, the same patterns started to appear. There were flashes of speed, moments of promise, but the same negatives began to surface through time. Inconsistency, poor performances and top equipment, seemingly undeserving recognition, and worst of all, controversy. Once Hailie Deegan moved into the Truck Series, she did show signs of speed. However, she never seemed to be able to crack the top 10 while running for David Gilliland Racing and ThorSport Racing. She still managed to receive a ride in the O'Reilly Auto Parts Series in 2024, a ride that many viewed was undeserving, and finished mostly outside the top 20 in a majority of her races. Eventually, she would be kicked out of the ride by the middle of the season and would move on over into the Indy Lights Series. As for controversy, during one of the live streams that she was running, she did say a particular word that many viewed as highly inappropriate, which led her down a pathway where many were against her from there moving forward.
This is fun. Oh, hey, who's the behind me? Don't do that, please.
For Natalie Decker, it seemed like she was always on the wrong end for the fans, as her results never seemed to come up to par, whether it was the ARCA Series, Truck Series, or the Xfinity Series. Controversy always surrounded Natalie Decker throughout her career, as she seemed to make mistakes after mistakes, both on and off the track. And lastly, for Toni Breidinger, she did receive an opportunity to run full-time with Trigon Garage. However, her results were mediocre at best with such a top team, and she was let go after one full-time season. She now runs part-time in the series, where many assume that her career is already over as a full-time driver. And even though many presume that Danica Patrick would open the floodgates for female drivers to come into the sport, today there are no full-time female drivers competing in the NASCAR Cup Series. For decades, women have been part of NASCAR's story from the very beginning to some of the biggest stages in motorsports. There have been moments where it felt like history was right around the corner, where the first female superstar in NASCAR wasn't a question of if, but when. And yet that moment still hasn't arrived. Not because the opportunity hasn't existed, and not because the effort hasn't been there, But because in a sport as difficult as NASCAR, breaking through takes more than just talent. It takes timing, it takes opportunity, and sometimes it takes the right moment. So now the question isn't just what happened to the pipeline, it's whether the next breakthrough is still ahead.